this thing work? Okay, it works. Great. So I'm just gonna be honest up front here. I'm gonna be doing what Tony alluded to here, and I'm gonna be kind of learning on the go. Moderation of a panel is new to me, so I will be incorporating feedback and adjusting as we go here. However, we got a great panel today. We're going to talk about investing to build a city, and I couldn't think of better people to talk about that with. And so, for a first question, I just want to address it to Clara, because you've got, through Revolution, you've got a broad perspective with the rise of the rest and other things happening across the country. And I think a good way to get started may be to talk about even just some things that you've seen in different cities that have been working, things that maybe haven't worked, if you've got something to share, and then maybe we can talk about that relative to our cities and if we've seen the same things or haven't.
Sure. I think a broad thing that we focus on at Revolution in terms of identifying cities that we're really excited about and where we think there's a lot of opportunity is first and foremost where there is some layer of seed and incubator formation there, and also where there are sort of strong seed points of entrepreneurial folks and engineering pockets. So some case study cities that we think about a lot and spend a lot of time on are like Pittsburgh, where you have Carnegie Mellon, you've got University of Pittsburgh, you have a broad UPMC health center that has a lot of innovative stuff happening, and then you have a big Google campus. And those sorts of agents help facilitate a community around it. But in a lot of those markets across the US, they're typically really underserved by later stage capital. So even Series A, Series B capital isn't really feeding into it in the same way that you find in New York or in the Valley. And I think there's a really big opportunity for firms like ours, firms like yours, to go in and help bridge that gap and get these cities really growing, as opposed to having a few break out from seed stage and then be forced to move to either the Valley or New York or Boston to find later stage capital.
That's an interesting point, because I think, it's taken, I've been in Chicago, so I'm also going to be a panelist here. So I've been, in Chicago for 9 years now, and I think we've just sort of hit that point now where the growth stage capital is sort of our next issue. And that's why a lot of us have gotten together and we're doing a venture capital summit for exactly that purpose, to try to draw in those later stage capital partners to come visit Chicago and see some of our hand-picked set of about 30 companies that are at that stage. And I think it's having looked back on it, I think one of the things that got us there is frankly just having some big exits, so people start to take notice. So we've had Grubhub and Groupon and a number of others, and so what I think might be interesting to contrast this with is just to think a little bit about, and I'll go to Gabe for this, just think a little bit about like how you guys view rebuilding Detroit and what stage you're at and where do you think you need to go, and how are you thinking about the future to get to the point where it's like we've got to, you get to the point, it's a good point to be at, where it's like we've got to get Revolution in there, we've got to get later stage capital partners because we've got a number of companies going well.
Yeah, so rebuilding a city is a significant undertaking, and I think that having venture capital there is really important, and it very much helps, but there's a lot that goes into the recipe of doing that, and that's just one of the ingredients. For Detroit and where it's at right now, I think that the biggest advantage Detroit has is frankly the bankruptcy that has been filed, because it's really just wiped a clean slate to begin investment in a very fresh way. And up in, when a city is in a phase where it's teetering on bankruptcy, it's an extremely unstable environment. So you're not going to get outside investment coming in. Lots of insecurity in the investment community and elsewhere. But when that happened, it was instant security. Now everyone knows that's rock bottom. It's not going to get any better. And the other thing that's really helped is that acute oh shit moment, like we just filed bankruptcy, that's something that cities don't really have. A lot of them are just a slow, steady decline where no one sort of really notices and says, okay, here it is. And what that's done is it's galvanized the community into really stepping up and sort of delivering on a rebuilding. So the phase is we've seen amazing activity in technology startups in the past 18, 24 months. And some of those, that's kind of short in terms of horizon to get to true exit stage, but we have seen a pretty significant uptick in value. So on paper, our fund looks great. And then it's a matter of that becoming an actual reality. But there's a lot that goes into it, and what we're doing as a venture fund, we're clearly there as venture capitalists, but at the same time, we're really in it to win it for the city itself. So there's a real estate aspect to it. There's a live, work, play initiative that sort of lots of people are moving on all three of those fronts to help build a city.
So, one thing I thought would be interesting to learn more about, also because I don't know a lot about it, Paul, is the Crystal Tech Fund and what your vision is, thinking about being in DC, which is a place that was actually the second place we ever did, Frank and I ever did a tech cocktail event way back in the day. And it's always been a place, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it's like kind of always been a place that's been strong in technology because you've got the government there, so you get a big buyer there, and then there are a lot of firms that have figured out how to sell into to the big buyer, and so that there are these companies around, and a number of them get started. So when you think about the Crystal Tech Fund, what's that kind of open space in the marketplace that you saw to kind of go in and say we need to do this, and then how do you tie that in, like some of the other folks on the panel have, to the community piece and building that ecosystem around tech?
Well, so I'll tell you, it's pretty complicated. So I spent the last 5 years thinking about this, and I'll go into detail on anything you want, but there's two things that are really important to understand. I think the first is that our fund operates as a traditional fund in the sense that our fiduciary duty overrides everything. So from a paperwork standpoint, from a legal standpoint, our responsibility to our LPs is to invest money in the companies, regardless of location, that will return the most money to them. Now, that being said, so our fund actually has no direct ties to Crystal City. However, what's fascinating is on the other side of it, we have this business deal where we effectively have control over almost 8 million square feet of space. And so we have a lot of influence on who comes in and what kind of events might happen and things like that. And so the thing I would just say is that I don't know that building Crystal City via the Crystal Tech Fund is the right way, but it's sort of the only way I know how to create sustainable growth. And so what we've done is we've just been investing in high growth companies since March of this year, did 12 deals so far. I think what's interesting though is that some other cities around the country and in Europe have taken this idea of creating the base layer, right? The incubators and the accelerators and the angel groups. And that's been really helpful. The tack that we've sort of taken is that I think that the best opportunity for cities to rebuild today, at least in the context of venture-funded companies, is to focus on these post-seed stage companies. So what we say is that for this particular fund, we say, we'd like to see that you've raised $250,000 or more from people we know, or we'd like to see a gross annualized run rate of $500,000 a year or more. And if you slice the world that way, all of a sudden, you're left with a really interesting subset. And so I guess what I'm really saying as I beat around the bush a little bit is that perhaps the best way to build a city in the short term is to offer enough money for these companies that have proven themselves a little bit. And if hopefully they come, right? Hopefully they come, but they don't have to. I think in practice, half of our companies have decided to move. The other half have stayed in Tennessee and Texas and New York, and that's okay. That's all right. Good companies ultimately have to go wherever they want to go, but we're kind of unique in the sense that our fund is not tied to the city, although we want it to be. But
yeah, no, that was helpful. So, Andy, as you think of the Vegas Tech Fund and the next steps that you guys have, and we've talked even a little bit about, we deal with this in Chicago too, which is the follow-on capital piece, and you've got some companies starting to break out, and Tony kind of alluded to, a bigger bet that you may make. But what's the thinking been now that, you've got a lot of these things going, 100 portfolio companies, things are moving, in terms of follow-on capital that you guys can provide, but how else to attract follow-on capital to Vegas and get investors to say, hey, look, I got to be looking at things here?
Yeah, there's kind of the way that we're doing things now, which is different than the way things were done many years ago. where the standard is to try and bring in money from the coast once you get a team up to that level and to start building those relationships. And we did that very early, and we can execute on that. But as we started looking at how that's affecting other secondary tier markets, once those teams are successful and they have an exit, then all of that money and resources goes right back out to the coast. And so your community isn't gaining as much as it could. It's not that it isn't a good thing, it's just not as great as it could be if we were able to flip that around a little bit and get the investors that you already have in your community involved in these new companies. So that's a piece that we're interested in pursuing is this the time where we're able to cross that chasm of the traditional investor who only invests in what they know, and the one thing they don't know for absolute sure is anything tech. Mm-hmm. However, when you look at their business and where they're making their money, a majority of the time that's being driven by some sort of technology because it's just an enabler. It's a part of everything that we do.
Well, that's the irony, right? Is that that's where they're making the most money. They just don't know.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And that's where we had hoped that through starting with the seed fund, we would be able to start showing that this is where new business is being created. It's not there's not a differentiator between traditional and tech. It's just business, and that's how communities are going to grow. And you have a ton of great entrepreneurs in every community. Otherwise, your community wouldn't be there. It would have been a lost city of some sort. So how can we bring those two things together and get those who have gotten us to where we're at to then participate actively with those who are going to get us to where we're going? And that part of it is really exciting to see that starting to come together.
Yeah, it's interesting. We've got some parallels even in Chicago about, we talked a little bit about this last night, but we've got these parallels in Chicago where there are a lot of people who have made a lot of money over time in manufacturing and all these industries that even today I think are more and more tech-driven businesses. I mean, you go into, I worked at one of these companies that did distribution, and you go into the distribution center and the whole thing is run by software written by the team I was working on. I mean, that business doesn't exist and can't do what it needs to do without software. And a few years down the road now, I've heard from my buddies that are still there that they finally view themselves as a software company. Sure. And I think that's starting to change. But we kind of struggle with the same thing. And I think one of the things, and I'd like to get the take of the panel here a little bit too, is that's helped us in Chicago is to really start thinking about the strengths as a city that we have. Mm-hmm. So we've kind of looked at it and said, geez, we've got a lot of strengths in these industries like manufacturing, distribution, even just B2B software, broadly pharmaceuticals, and any one of those business lines has software that kind of runs beneath it. And so what can we be doing in those areas to be building companies in that space? Since we've got expertise, people who know those businesses, we should probably see more innovative startups in those spaces, and we should probably, as a city, we should be the ones to create some of those innovations since we've got the infrastructure. I mean, what have you guys seen relative to saying, like, let's build from our strengths, and how do we leverage that?
Well, I mean, I don't know if I'm going to piss off anybody when I say this, but I think the actual, so I think there's entrepreneurs everywhere, right? I think the real issue, the underlying issue is, if you think about where the money comes from for investors, it's typically high net worth individuals. It's on one extreme, and then you got family offices and corporates in the middle, and then you got institutions on the other extreme, and there's lots of different things in between those two. Fundamentally, I think it's just a big misunderstanding about where returns come from. Sort of like what Andy was saying earlier. Just to throw a stat out there, it's generally understood that there's about $40 trillion sitting in the hands of boomers, right? And so, now the bad news is the boomers don't really know very much about what's happening, especially in flyover states. Their notion of tech is on the coasts, for better or for worse. The other thing, so that's the bad news. The good news is they're not going to live very long. And a lot of people say...
Is that the part you didn't want to piss people off?
I did a little bit of research and I realized most people don't live very long. But that being said, the interesting thing is that most of these people will be transferring that wealth to millennials, right? Everybody's age here, within our lifetime. In fact, let me say it a different, more blunt way. The largest wealth transfer in human history will happen within our lifetimes. Now, the good news is that those people are looking in their backyard. They're increasingly tech-enabled. So I think there's hope. And in fact, if we look at the LP base that I've dealt with over the last 8 funds I've raised, there's been this huge shift. Just 5 years ago, raising my first fund, going from mostly institutions and a few high net worth. Now the vast majority across hundreds of LPs is ultra high net worth people. Well, high net worth is defined as 200K or higher. Ultra high net worth, family offices and corporate. So the shift is happening. It may not be felt on the ground floor, like on the street, but a lot's changed in 5 years, a lot. And I think within the next 5 years, we're only going to see more. And you start to see, like you guys started 3 years ago in Detroit. I forget who that other, there's another fund that just opened up in St. Louis with 50 or 100 million bucks. And we're starting to see more and more funds open up in other cities, and that's hopeful. I couldn't do what I was doing in DC 5 years ago. When I decided to move back from the Valley last year, I just moved the whole team because we could. You could run in an out-of-the-way place.
So you talk about playing to strengths, and I say this not just as someone who's been in venture capital for a couple of years, but before that, being in a true technology startup that I joined when there were maybe about 20 people, and we grew that to over 500 people in a number of offices around the country. It's really hard to attract tech talent in Silicon Valley. And we opened an office in Seattle and in San Francisco, sort of in and around that area. And it was just very different from attracting the tech talent in the Midwest. There are a number of world-class educational institutions, University of Michigan, Michigan State University, in Chicago, you've got a number of them in that area. And traditionally what happened, in let's say going back 5 years and then before that, a lot of times people just graduate. Great engineering talent just graduates and then boom, goes to either coast. Where the cost of living is dramatically higher. And the loyalty among people within those offices, we found, was a lot less than what we were seeing for people who stayed in the Midwest. And I'm not trumpeting Midwest values. I think it's in a. I'm just viewing that as a strength of the region that we're in. And then probably somewhat unique to Detroit is you've got the auto industry. So there's a long history of tier 1, tier 2 auto suppliers. And these days, cars are just as much computer as they are machinery. So we're seeing a lot of new innovation and a lot of tech startup businesses leveraging that.
So, I think you bring up some really good points too around when you think of strengths. Maybe it's not just industry strengths; it's university strengths. It's other institutions that have been in these areas for a while. And so, one thing we could talk about a little bit here, I think would be helpful, since we've touched on to some degree how tech leaders should get involved and how venture capital firms are getting involved to try to build ecosystems. The other piece of that is how do government officials get involved, or should they? Or there's a bunch of debates you could have around that. In Chicago, I would suggest that the way Mayor Emanuel gets involved is probably what you want, which is just sort of cheerleading and getting up there and saying we've got something going on. He's got a national stage to do that. It doesn't hurt that he's championing what's going on, but there could be other ways to be involved. And also too, like, how do the universities get involved? If you think about the Midwest, Drive Capital putting a fund together, a lot of that was Ohio State stepping up and saying, yeah, we should be, as a university, investing in people who come out of this university and create companies, and we should do it here instead of losing people who otherwise maybe want to stay here or grew up here or whatever. And so maybe Andy, I'll start with you about how has that played out in Downtown Project and the Vegas Tech Fund in terms of all these other institutions that are around, whether it's UNLV or the mayor or whomever, and what roles do they take, what's worked, what hasn't?
Yeah, the general concept here is trying to get everyone refocused on the things that they're the best at, that they enjoy doing the most. And over the years, many of these organizations have tried to take on things because there wasn't anyone else there to do it, and so they were filling gaps. And it may not necessarily be the thing that they're the most proficient at. So if you can start moving those back into an enterprise role where you're building out a sustainable model around that, whether that's investing or business development, and then let the organizations handle the piece that they can be the best at, I think a great example here is something as simple as more bike lanes. When we first got here, myself and my wife, 2.5 years ago, there was basically one lane in downtown that ran from here out to Red Rock in a straight line, and that was it. That's not something that we can do anything about. But the city has had a plan in place and has been able to execute on that. And just in a very short amount of time for government infrastructure build out, there are miles and miles of bike lanes that are now available, which increases transportation, which then allows us to get around, with the addition of mobility, all of those pieces that just come together and we wouldn't have been able to do, and they are. And by freeing up some of those resources to accelerate that change, then we're all able to work together. So the public-private combination doesn't have to be let's pool our funds and do something together. It can be use your funds for what you're the best at, and we'll do the same, but we'll stay in contact and communicate on it to make sure that it is still moving things forward.
Yeah, I mean, that part of, I can't remember the words you just used, but keeping the pools separate, the money, is super key. In fact, that's sort of the way that we operate as well. We wouldn't allow any government money to come into the fund so that they couldn't dictate how fund returns were modeled. But on the other side, they can do things that we can't, right? So they can build bike lanes. They can actually issue permits for the buildings we're building and things like that. So that being said, it's always this delicate balance, right? So one way that we've kind of dealt with this is that we've had to encourage our founders to focus on, for example, and this is probably just true in our little neighborhood. I don't know if it's true anywhere else, but in our little neck of the woods, we just say, like, look, these politicians don't give a shit about your product, and you shouldn't even like convince yourself that you need to do a demo. Focus on what you believe to be your job growth over the next 3 to 5 years, because that's what they really want to know, right? They need to understand how the tax base will grow, how the populace, the voter base will benefit, things like that. And it's not. I hate to be so direct about it, but that's sort of the reality. I think the reason why there's been this big mistake. By the way, you got to be careful because I go on these rants, but this is 5 years of just dealing with shit. But like, I think politicians really want to help. I think governments want to help. They just don't know any better, right? They're built around this idea of, they can build a road over the course of 10 years, but this idea of you guys starting something on a weekend and maybe making some money by Monday is foreign to them. And it's not that it's bad, that either way is bad. It's just that both sides never learn to talk to each other. And so I think on one side, I think founders, you guys need to learn how to talk to like the people that run these cities in the language they understand. And for anybody that runs cities in here, I think, you should probably take a weekend to go visit a startup weekend and just see how companies are built today. Steve Case they were broadcasting during lunch said something interesting about, a lot of governments are still stuck with this idea that to have a $20 billion company, you have to have 20,000 employees. Right, and so like we come from a world from the tech side where you can have you could be WhatsApp with 70 employees and be worth that much money. It's just very different. It's very foreign.
What we've seen, and there's really, I guess maybe there are two pieces to the answer to your question. There's I'd say universities, sort of quasi-public, and then separately government. From an educational institution standpoint, we've seen a big change. There are a number of programs and even schools that are being developed with degrees in entrepreneurship. And I'm not just talking about business school. I mean, the University School of Information, University of Michigan School of Information is one where they have entrepreneurial tracks. Law school wants to ingrain their students into the startup community and entrepreneurship. So that's something that I think, because being a startup now is in vogue, if you will. I mean, I guess I'm old enough to say that when I was getting out of school, if you told someone you were going to work for a startup, they kind of said, "Oh, good luck with that."
Couldn't get a job.
Yeah, you could.
Yeah, right. Whereas now, it's a very acceptable thing, and you're getting a lot of support from the universities. And we view our role is to aid them and help them. So, in our fund, we sit on boards. We will have meetups and give talks on it, and we really want to encourage that. Separately, on the government side, we have, we've got in the state of Michigan, we've got a governor he's a tech geeky kind of guy. The chief technology officer for the state of Michigan is really keyed into these issues and understands them very well. And when you look at the economic development, like the MEDC, Michigan Economic Development Corporation, those are quasi-governmental agencies that have money to invest. So we've had a couple of them invest with us in our fund, but we make sure that their investment doesn't buy them the right to tell us what to do. Their investment buys them the right to encourage and participate in supporting a company. And then, of course, the obvious one that governments can do is provide tax relief to startups. Give them the tax break, they can build up the bigger tax base, and then you tax.
So, Clara, do you have any just maybe broad takeaways from everything that you guys see across the country, and maybe like kind of some public-private partnerships or other things that have been working well?
Yeah, I think to your point earlier about different areas specializing in certain things, we've seen a lot of that in the Flavor of the Rise of the Rest tour. Last go around in Cincinnati, you see a lot of design-focused people because there's such a big design center. In Pittsburgh, you see a lot of stuff around robotics. In DC, every day, you see a lot of stuff around GovTech. And I think that really helps start the seeds of a community. And then when you think about gaining mind share from folks around the US and around the country, it helps accelerate the other companies around that and getting partnerships. And one thing that we really focus on at Revolution is trying to help our companies land partnerships with folks that aren't just in their neck of the woods, because that's part of something that's been so powerful about the Valley is that you have all these companies together that can help each other, and partnerships can be huge accelerants for gaining consumer mindshare. And if you're able to shine a spotlight on different cities and really help accelerate those connectivities, it can be a real change agent for not just the companies themselves, but the city's whole ecosystem.
Thank you. So, one other thing I would suggest too, we didn't talk about too much, is just also I think the role of governments in investing in basic research, which I think is one of these government investments that many studies say, hey, this actually pays off in a big way in the long run, and they're the right folks to do it because it's too early for venture capitalists to get involved usually when it's in a lab somewhere, so it needs to get from there to some place where you can commercialize it. And one interesting thing I worked on directly in Chicago was setting up this digital manufacturing lab, which is working on basically creating a lab for everything from Boeing type size companies all the way down to your small manufacturers, so they can leverage supercomputing to faster, make their product design processes faster through better models. And one thing you had to do that, and I saw this unfortunately really close up, is you got somebody that has enough power to convene all the universities and everybody to say, we got to go for one bid, because if you guys all bid by yourselves, the federal government's never going to give us this. And so I think another role that government leaders and other people can play is convening those groups and saying, we've got to do this together for the betterment of all of us, and trying to outline that, and that seems to work pretty well. So right before I go to Q&A, I will throw out a book recommendation for anybody who's interested in these types of topics, because I like to give book recommendations. It's called, and the title is super depressing, but it's written by an economist, so and I say that with an economics background. It's called Boulevard of Broken Dreams. It's really not that depressing. I don't know why they call it that, but it was written by Josh Lerner at Harvard Business School, and it's about a lot of he basically says, look, no one really knows exactly what the formula is for governments and other things to get involved in trying to build tech communities, but I've worked on enough stuff where at least I've seen some patterns, and he lays out a bunch of case studies that have worked and haven't worked and so forth. So it's a really instructive book, and we used it when we were working on the economic plan in Chicago, I think to pretty good effect about what we should be involved with, what we should probably be. So that said, we've been doing pretty well. According to this, we only have a minute and 45 seconds, minute 40 seconds for Q&A, but I'm sure we could go a little over if we need to, so let's open it up.